Hello and welcome back to Startups, People and Equity. This is a space where we discuss topics, related to startups, people and equity. We hope that you will enjoy listening to today's episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. Let's dive straight in.
Ian, after completing his studies in geography at the University of Edinburgh, joined Goldman Sachs's human capital practice. After spending almost 4 years at the global investment bank, he switched gears and landed a job at Improbable, a British metaverse technology company. And whilst there, Improbable actually went from 75 people to over 1,000 with Ian at the helm for everything people. After this exposure to the Web3 world, Ian went solo and is since helping Web2 and Web3 companies level up their people game. When not hard at work, in his garden office pod, which we can see right now from the inside, he's either cultivating the impressive vegetable garden just next to it, or spending time with his wife and 2 daughters, or actually geeking out on personal wellness and fitness. Super good to have you on the show. We've been building a relationship for a couple of months now, and I'm very happy to record this episode.
It's great to be here. Thanks a lot for having me. And you did miss one important aspect, which is my dog called Hugo. He's very, very important and definitely can't be missed.
So sorry about that. I'll apologize to Hugo with like a good bone or something when next time around. What does Goldman Sachs's human capital practice do?
Goldman Sachs that's a good question. They are much like you would expect from any sort of large corporate HR and talent function, responsible for a multitude of different areas. And they have a huge team looking after every kind of different aspect of HR. It tends to be, they might not like me saying this, but it tends to be slightly more on the operational side for a lot of things. I know there's big efforts to try and change that. But I just think the nature of some of these large companies means it can be very hard to have a real strategic seat at the table and really drive a lot of change. So I think inevitably they tend to be on the operational side. But yeah, it was a great place to start my career. The sort of standards you're held to at Goldman Sachs are incredible. I'll never forget sort of when writing an email, you had to have the order in the to list had to be from most experienced to least experienced. And it's little things like that just sort of really set you up. In my view, they set you up very well, that attention to detail. So it was great 4 years for me, really, where I kind of just learned how to be an adult.
Would you say that a human capital practice at a place like that, if you want to be in it and successful and maybe indoctrinated into it, are these certificates that we hear of that you can get certified into HR practices and so on, are they going in the same direction and a person would really benefit from going through something like that?
I'm probably not the right person to ask about that because I've never done any formal qualifications. If you think about the CIPD, which is one of the larger ones, for me, it didn't appeal to me. I'd rather learn and be hands-on. I think there are some people who may benefit from that approach, but for me, it wasn't a thing. And I have to say, I don't think it's held me back with any companies I've ever worked with or spoken to. I don't think it's really widely sort of sought after in banking or technology. I think there are some industries where it probably would help, perhaps like if you were going into the government or something. But yeah, for the industries I've been in, it's definitely not been a focus.
Yeah, our friend just went through it, and the contrast that she experienced was something that I could imagine a company like Goldman Sachs would value versus a startup would actually try to steer away from it. Yeah, it's very interesting to see they make certificates of.
Yeah, totally agree.
What was your thinking from Goldman Sachs moving on to Improbable? Kind of paint the scene for us a little bit.
Yeah, so I loved my time at Goldman Sachs, as I say, it's definitely not for everybody, but it really is an amazing learning environment. And I guess my strategy there was figure out, who are the best people here I can learn from at the different things they do, whether that was a manager or somebody who was great at giving speeches. I would find those people, seek them out, learn from them. And that was really great. And also think about, well, where can I add value? It's very difficult when you're working with very experienced people, such as you do get at Goldman Sachs. But for me, for example, I worked in the employee relations team for the last 2 years. I was never going to be a great advisor because, they had so much more experience than me, but I realized there was a big gap with data, reporting, Excel, and so I decided to focus on that area and try and stand out a little bit and do some of the things that others in the team weren't so good at. So I sort of got to that stage, and for me, it's all about learning. I'm at my best, and that's a consistent theme throughout my career, is I like to be uncomfortable. I like to be learning. And I started to get to the stage with Goldman Sachs where there was things I wanted to do and try. And just like any large corporate, it's very difficult to try and actually have a real impact, see what you're doing. I'd started to get interested in the technology space. I started to teach myself to code Ruby on Rails, which I thought was really exciting. And then I subsequently got laughed at by my technology friends when I told them about it. And I was lucky enough that Improbable at that time, they had a recruitment team in place and they were just starting to think about putting their foundational HR practices in place. And really, it was a huge punt from Herman, the CEO, Aaron, who was leading recruitment at that time, to sort of bring me on board. I didn't have relevant experience. You can't really take much you did at Goldman Sachs and apply that to a 50-person startup in London. And so that really appealed to me because it was a chance to come in and sort of from day one, I had the chance to say, well, this is what HR is going to be at Improbable. This is where we're going to add value. And that was a pretty unique opportunity. So very grateful that they took the punt.
Was it a very different postcode that all of a sudden you had to commute to?
I mean, it couldn't have been, the whole experience couldn't have been more different. I remember sort of going in with my Goldman Sachs suit on and tie, and there was somebody walking around in flip-flops and sort of top with no arms. And I remember negotiating my salary over a game of foosball with lots of people around. And so it was a huge culture shock. And actually, I remember, don't know if I've ever told anyone this, but I said to my wife, right, I need to go and buy a startup wardrobe. And I went out and I bought like t-shirts and hoodies. And I think I wore it for 1 week. And I was like, I've actually missed the point of this. The point is for me to wear what I feel comfortable in. And so for me, that's always just going to be a shirt or whatever. And so that was kind of a lesson early on, is like, it's not about just dressing down for the sake of dressing down. It was about making sure you're comfortable and that, you can focus, relax and do your work. And you don't need to worry about the formalities around things. So there was many lessons as I made that transition from corporate to startup.
And talking of transitions, you said that you joined when, there were not many HR practices yet at Improbable, where then you ended up with 1,000-person team. So would you be able to recall some of the milestones or steps that you as a company went through, and how did it, maybe some bad things in there would also be fun to hear.
Yeah. It's a great question. So I would describe my time at Improbable as just a bunch of mistakes. And, I really wish, I look back and think, oh man, I wish I knew a lot of the things that I know now, having gone through that. And I think the first thing to say is it's extremely hard to scale a company like Improbable, who, first of all, we were scaling up rapidly. We had 3 different business lines. We had a sort of platform business, a consulting business. We worked with the government. We worked with games. So, there was a lot going on. And then you add in the fact that we expanded into China. We expanded into the US. We bought 3 companies and integrated those. So really, it was just kind of one learning journey to another. There was never a sort of like period where I felt sort of I knew what I was doing. I was comfortable. And I think that's great. And I think I'd call out a couple of stages, I guess. So in those early days, when I joined, say it was maybe 50 to 100 type thing, it's all about, you get away with not having things in place at that stage. You really need a clear mission, a clear purpose. And, Herman, the CEO, was extremely good. And a lot of the founders were very good at that. They were talking about the metaverse 10 years ago, that well before anyone else had sort of really talked about that word. And so you just get away with it. People are excited. You bump into people. You don't need to, we were all in the office at that time. We were largely based in London. You don't need lots of processes and strict ways of working, et cetera, et cetera. It just happens organically and people are excited to be part of the mission. Then there's almost phase 2 where you start expanding beyond the 100 type mark. You open up an office abroad. You start to have people in different areas. And then it's about formalizing some of the things and ways of working. And, culture is a good example of that, where I don't think you want to overthink culture too early on in a startup. You want to be aware of it, but naturally culture is going to feed from the founders and the way they're operating, the people they're rewarding, etc. When you start getting into that scale, you have to really think about documenting it, being crystal clear on what are the aspects we really want to hold on to here, and what do we want to let go of as we scale past just maybe perhaps the founding team and their way of working and their way of operating. And you have to be so deliberate with that in everything you do, from the way you talk about the company to your interview processes to the way the office looks in China relative to the way the office looks in London. So there was that's kind of the middle phase. And I guess for me as an individual, it kind of correlates, which is it goes from sort of a bit of an IC hands-on to then, you've got to learn to lead a team and manage others. And then the third phase I'd probably call out is that real scaling up. So, in our case, we received SoftBank funding, which was 500 million, which was a sort of huge amount at that time. And basically, it's just all about scale. It's like you suddenly realize that having 6 different systems that don't actually speak to each other, and the data sits in 6 different places, and you're trying to pull together reports, and you're trying to onboard people quickly and communicate across these different entries. It's just extremely, extremely hard. So you really have to invest in your systems, your very clear processes. Everything needs to be documented on the wiki. And it's really just that scale efficiency side of things. So, and for me, that was kind of moving from a manager to then a manager of managers, which is, again, as an individual, is a hard transition to make, and is always a very difficult thing for managers to go through. So those are just kind of the 3 phases that jump out, but I'm sure if I thought about it some more, there would probably be a few others in there as well.
What were your phases? How did you track the company's development?
I think, as I say, very similar, which is, I can honestly say I was uncomfortable the entire time and, made a lot of mistakes. So, you go in as an IC, first of all, and you're just scrambling around. And I think I made the mistake of, I thought I was just there to make employees happy. I thought that like the role of HR is to make employees happy. And so, let's, whatever that may be, whatever that may involve, and I think that's definitely a mistake I see a lot of HR people do, particularly in the junior years, whereas it kind of took me a while. And I think I lost a bit of credibility with perhaps the likes of finance. We didn't have a good relationship at that time. I think they saw me and my team as just kind of wanting to do the fun things and not having actual credibility that we were doing the right things for the business. And so that was certainly kind of an early on mistake I made. And also I came from Goldman Sachs again, and, we would roll out a new comp system and it would just be accepted. Like, there would never, I'm sure there was a lot of mumbling and grumbling in the background and people probably hated us for it, but, nobody would challenge it or question it. And I remember rolling out our first sort of very early iteration of a compensation scheme. at Improbable, and engineers were asking me, well, why have we gone for this approach, and why didn't we think about this, and where's the research that says this is the right way? And I was shocked. I couldn't believe it, and that we were getting challenged and questioned, and surely they should just know that we're the experts. And so again, there was like a hard lesson there in terms of, really we have to build with the people in the company, treat them as our customers. And, this is really where I tried to learn from people in the company, whether that was our product managers or designers, design thinking, and try and think, well, how are they building their products? We need to do the same in Improbable. And so definitely something that we kind of got better at. And then really, as you kind of scale up, you have to make that decision in a scale up like Improbable. When do I need to bring really good people under me, and when do I need to bring good people above me? So, and that's very difficult to do. It's always, you have to sort of be very conscious of your ego. And so, I made the decision at one point to bring in a CPO above myself. And at the time when I wasn't looking after talent, our talent manager, we made the decision that we wanted somebody to come in and we wanted to learn from them for a stage. And that's a difficult thing to do. You're used to running the shop and reporting to the CEO, and you've got to suddenly have a CPO above you. But I think it's very, very important that you recognize when actually, we're maybe our depths here. We need someone to learn from and be aware of that, make that decision. And likewise, I remember in the early days, we're mainly just hiring junior people, but as we started to grow and really get to that scale up phase, I knew we had to bring in experienced people. And so, for example, brought somebody in with 10 years of experience in compensation at Google. And I remember my first one-on-one, I was like incredibly nervous. I was like, how can I manage this guy? He's got way more experience than me. And so you just have to go on that journey of understanding, well, where do I add the value and what's my role, and making sure, I turn from being involved in the day to day and being involved in, well, where's the company going? Making sure our people strategy is aligned with the company strategy. And so the role was totally different by the end, much more focused with the C team, and just making sure we were focused on prioritizing the right things, and that the team underneath are free to do what they do best. So yeah, lots of other mistakes along the way as well.
At what stage did you bring in the CPO?
We brought him in probably just like in that middle stage. He was probably with us for maybe a year or so, or a year and a half or so. And I think there's never an easy, I don't think there's like always the right time to do it, but I think it's just, you should constantly be asking yourself when you're in these types of roles, should I be thinking about this? I mean, first of all, get out, meeting people, networking, having mentors, etc., is obviously crucially important. But I think it is always worth asking, like, maybe this is the right time for me to think about bringing somebody in to learn from, and, not letting that impact your confidence and ego. It's very hard to do, but you just have to sort of focus on the company and focus on your own learning. And yeah, it worked out well for us. It's, we wouldn't be where we were, and I wouldn't have been able to take on everything if we hadn't sort of made those decisions along the way.
And the senior people, like this compensation person, when was that?
That was probably at that, again, just in that sort of end of the middle stage, when you start having to move away from, training up junior people to, you need to bring in people a lot more experienced than you. So, we were maybe 2-3 years in. And again, as a manager, and just as an individual, it's intimidating to go through that, to have to sort of start, managing people who are way more experienced than you. You're full of self-doubt and constantly questioning yourself. But again, you just have to go on that journey and figure out, well, where should I spend my time? And most of all, make sure I'm unblocking and not blocking some of these great people who are working with me.
Did you have different one-on-one conversations with that person versus with junior people? How did you change the structure?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It moves from, it really moves from a conversation more led by me with some of the more junior people, where maybe I was being a bit more prescriptive on what we needed to do, or priorities or feedback, to a conversation led by, the very experienced people. What were they doing? What were their priorities? Where did they need me? So it's a very different sort of nature of relationship. And I think again, it's all about giving them the autonomy and space. That was certainly my philosophy.
I like it. I especially look up to you for thinking about bringing someone in above you. I think that's probably something that a lot of people miss. Were you, if you look around the teams that surrounded you at Improbable, were you kind of alone in that thinking, or was that similar in every department?
It definitely varied massively, but I just think you have to recognize with a startup like Improbable that not everybody is going to be able to scale with the company. And like that really was the case for us. Some people can and have that and can constantly learn and develop and grow, but it's very difficult to do that. And so we decided early on that we would try and make it part of our culture to recognize when that wasn't the case. We knew that not everybody and not every one of the founders were going to be in the same roles as we sort of scaled up. And so it was a mixture, but largely, we talked a lot about humility. We talked about replace yourself. That was part of our values early on because we recognized the need to be aware of this. And so that makes it a lot easier when you have that culture in the company to do that. And it wasn't seen as weakness. It was seen as strength. If you can say, hey, actually, maybe now is the time to look at bringing someone on above. And, sometimes that person would stay, sometimes they would move on. And the person who had been underneath, they then sort of end up being a better leader themselves. And so yeah, that was definitely our experiences. It was a mixture.
I'm wondering, now that we're talking about the people space and the compensation and the growth of like the trajectory of the company going from so small to so big, if you had to go back and you had the magic wand, would you do the succession of first juniors and then seniors, or would you flip it on its head and go seniors from the get-go, and then once we have the time, we do junior hiring?
It's a very good question. I think that the reality is that startups at that scale, size, funding, they can't afford to bring in a bunch of seniors. And that's just the reality. To have full-time experienced people who are coming from Google is just wasn't really a thing for us. So our strategy was take junior people and train them up and invest in them. And, very proud to say they've pretty much all gone on to be sort of CPOs themselves now, a couple of our most junior people. And however, one thing I would say is that perhaps I was just a bit more head in the sand, or maybe it wasn't as much of a thing. But as I think about now, some of the consultancies out there, such as Equity People, for example, Equity was one space that we definitely made a mess of in the early years. Or Justly, for example, on the compensation side, Alistair, I would leverage some of these experts earlier on to avoid some of the sort of pitfalls and mistakes. And I'd be strategic about that. Where do I need to complement my experience or the team's experience? Where do I want to bring somebody in? So I think I would have done more of that and really thought about what do we really want to invest in here, and bring in somebody to help, an external consultant to help lead on that. But I just don't think there's many startups out there who can afford to sort of bring in people with that experience onto their permanent team at that stage.
I keep getting the feeling that Improbable saw the people role also as strategic, which is not always the case in startups. So I wanted to ask you, how did you, because I'm sure because you were there, that's also what made them feel that it is strategic. What were some of the things that you brought to the executive table that made them listen to you and consult you on things?
Yeah, I think so. That goes back to the biggest mistake I made when we started. So I think, first of all, ultimately, you have to be in a business and you have to have a CEO where they care about the people. Like, that kind of goes without saying. We were very fortunate that Herman was focused on the culture from day one. He knew that in order to be successful, that we had to, get that right. And, we had to be a great place to work with a strong mission, culture, etc. So, I think it's very difficult if you're working in opposition to somebody who isn't focused on that in the same way, then it makes your life a lot harder. So we were lucky that we had that. And that was obviously, as I'm interviewing Improbable and I'm interviewing them, that's the key things I'm kind of looking for. And that's really what I want to understand. And so then but then the mistake I made was, again, when I joined, focusing just too much on let's just do things for the sake of things, we don't have whatever that may be, a learning program in place. So let's roll out a learning program and let's do fun cheese and wine on a Friday or whatever it is. Just because, that's what other companies are doing. And that's what I think we should be doing. And the employees will, really enjoy that. Well, the way that you become strategic as a function is by clearly being able to articulate why what we're doing will drive the business forward. The best thing that we can do for employees as HR is help build a successful business, not sort of just focus on the engagement. It's like, how do we build a great business? And so it was only maybe after a year and a half or 2 years that I've managed to flip to really start to think that way. So, what does the business really care about right now? And how do we make sure we're driving that forward and we're having a successful impact on that? And then, so that's kind of the first one with your strategy. And then the second thing is like, you've got to show and you've got to advocate for what you do. And in Improbable's case, they were very data driven, of course, and so that's how the rest of the organizations reported on updates, statuses. And so that's what we, eventually that's the route we went down as well. So, we were, lots of people do it now, but we were using weekly engagement surveys, for example, and we've basically have been doing that for years now. And so, I realized that if I really wanted to show the impact, we measured our managers, we measured onboarding, so we really had to show the impact of what we were doing. And I think a view to making sure what you're doing supports the business, making sure you can measure it and articulate the value. I think those are the two ways that we managed to turn the HR function from probably being seen as more operational sort of to being much more strategic. But it was definitely a journey we had to go on.
Love the blueprint there that you gave. Thanks for that. And thanks for the plug earlier. I actually want to go back to your answer there because it kind of paved the way very nicely to moving on to your consulting practice. So was that the reason, because you saw so much value working with external people, that you wanted to become one yourself, or was it something completely different?
I think there was two reasons. So number one was I'm just personally at my best when I'm uncomfortable, learning, stretched. That's what I love. I love the building phase. I love making mistakes and growing. And Improbable was just flattening out a little bit. They weren't growing as much as they were. I had such good people sort of around me. I was working with a great exec team, and they're just like the challenge wasn't there in the same way for me personally. And so, Herman and I, the CEO, chatted about that for a while and kind of, gave him a long heads up that I was going to make the decision. And then second of all, I just thought, well, I've just been through such a journey. I've again made so many mistakes that I want to take some of those mistakes and I want to help other companies avoid that. So it was more along those lines. We weren't yet really working with many external consultants, and so it was a bit of a sort of a leap of faith, but it's definitely been a great experience.
That's fabulous to hear. Are most of your clients now come to you with specific ideas on we need help on progression or performance management, or do they come to you, Ian, we have no idea what we should do next, please help us?
So if I'm meeting somebody who's thinking about becoming an HR consultant, then I will tell them to focus on one area and be the go-to person in that area. And again, Justly, Equity People are great examples of that. You want to be known for something, it makes it a lot easier. You can turn it into more of a product. Now, all of that said, I've gone down the opposite route, which is based on, I've been very lucky that, so I've, almost immediately found a large client, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the Web3 space. So, and really that's a investment DAO, and they have a lot of portfolio companies. So there's so much work to be done there. And that, I'm sort of half in as a full-time employee with them. Which is great. And so that allows me to then sort of pick and choose the interesting projects that come along. And so my advice is think about a product and have a niche area. But in reality, I've been kind of much more fluid with that, just depending on who comes along with what. But I think ultimately it's about scale building and avoiding the sort of pitfalls. That's kind of, I guess, what I'm known for. And that's what people tend to come to me for.
I think we're bridging the two topics of Web2, Web3. Would you have, at the highest level, any insight into how is even the approach to people topics different between the two?
Yeah, great question. And something I spend a lot of time thinking about right now because I'm working with so many Web3 companies. So maybe, shall I set the scene about a DAO first of all, and then maybe I could talk about that because it's probably useful context. So a decentralized autonomous organization is what people may start hearing more and more about, which is right now the primary vehicle or one of the primary vehicles in Web3 for launching anything, a product, a group, a community. And really in summary, maybe the purpose of a DAO is primarily used to make decisions in a bottom-up management approach. There's no central authority of a DAO. Instead, power is distributed across all of the token holders, and of which anybody can hold a token, who collectively cast votes to make decisions. So just to bring that to life a little bit more, I'll give a few examples of a DAO. So the BitDAO or Mantle, which is what I work with, is a multi-billion-dollar treasury. So they're an investment DAO with multi-billion of dollars in a treasury. And anybody can propose where that we spend that money, and everybody who has a token votes yes or no effectively. This is simplifying it slightly, and then we decide to spend the treasury. So there's not a small group of individuals making the decision. It's very much everybody who's a token holder. Another example on the product side is Uniswap, which you could think of as like a bank for tokens. So you could swap tokens or buy tokens or leave tokens with them for sort of a fee. And all decisions about that platform are governed by the Uniswap token holders. So should we add another product offering, so that's not a small group of employees making that decision. Everybody who owns that token across the industry is making that decision. And then the last example I would give was maybe on a different route, like the Ukraine DAO. So everybody who bought that token is giving money into a treasury to be donated to those affected by the war. And everybody who has the token votes on where that money goes and where that money's spent. So that's just the context of DAOs, because I think it's important for people to understand in the Web3 space. I could probably talk about for a few hours on that topic. But to kind of answer and I should maybe just one last thing to add on DAOs is I don't want to pretend like that is definitely the way forward in the future. I think we're still in the experimentation phase. So look, we have problems around, I think it's something like less than 5% of the holders have the majority of the voting power because certain individuals hold a lot of the tokens. So it sort of takes away from the purpose. Just getting people to participate in regular voting takes a lot of effort, a lot of communication, comms. DAOs can be hacked, as we saw from the first ever DAO. So I think we should think of that as an experimentation space. I have no doubt DAOs will be around forever, but what exactly they'll look like and the use cases, I would say still TBC. But I don't think you can kind of talk about Web3 without touching on DAOs. And then to answer your specific question, how do the practices differ in Web2 to Web3? The one word that I think captures most of it is ownership. So I think people are drawn into Web3 because they want more ownership of let's say, the platforms they use or their own data or their money, as would be the case of like the blockchain. So what I think's happened is that spilled into the people space as well. And so the question I ask myself is, how do we give more ownership to people over their own careers? And none of these things are exclusive to Web3, but we're definitely seeing Web3 companies lead in a lot of these spaces. So to give you like specifics of there, the first of all is like the nature of an employee is very unclear. Most likely in Web3, you're contributing to a few different projects. So you could contribute to 4 or 5 different DAOs. You might have sort of one full-time role, but then be doing different bits on the side. You might be doing bounty work. So, this specific project needs done and there's a bounty that you get when you do it. So the nature of sort of full-time employment just it definitely is less relevant. It's about people having more control over who they're working with, etc. And even in some cases working under different IDs and personas. So you may have a design persona and you may have a sales persona, and people keeping these things separate and distinct. So that probably one example. Then another one would be the nature of, where I work. This is obviously a very hot topic when I work, but the decentralized nature of the blockchain means most of the teams are spread out across the globe, across multiple different locations. For example, we're seeing global salaries for some of our blockchain engineers become a thing, which is definitely going to be interesting to watch. Transparency. So, DAOs, for example, have to, if you're requesting money to work for a DAO, everything's open there. You can see exactly how much it is, what you're doing, your KPIs, how much you're getting for it. There's maybe ways around that if you're working in a team or a foundation, but certainly more transparency. And then, the nature of a manager, there's just a lot less focus on hierarchy. In the Web3 space, again, it's the ethos of blockchain. So, for example, with some of the teams I run, people run their own performance reviews. There's no manager there who's running it. Maybe you could use somebody as a sounding board, but you're responsible for your own career and your own decisions around things. Compensation, that for one thing, people are often paid in tokens, which creates quite an interesting dynamic. And again, most companies let people decide, is it all tokens or is it a mixture of cash, tokens, again, ownership. And then the last one I would say that just jumps out, I'm sure there's many more, but there's a lot more need to be involved in the community in the Web3 space. So if you really want to have impact on a DAO and drive things forward, then you've got to be out there campaigning. You have to, be getting people to support your proposals for the DAO. And so certainly the more senior you go, the senior leaders, they have to be out public on Twitter. It tends to be the usual forum right now, and building communities, around them. And they need to be a known name that people will support, and support their proposals and have faith in what they're doing, etc. So I'm sure there's many more other things that I'd call out, but certainly those are some of the high level themes and really the best people. So for example, when I moved into this space, I brought on somebody who worked who was a sort of self-managed consultant. So she helps companies move from sort of traditional management to more of a self-management approach. And I think that's where we can learn the most from some of those organizations. And that's certainly, I valued learning from the mistakes they'd made and thinking, well, can we apply that in the Web3 space?
I wanted to ask one more Web2, Web3 thing. I think of it as one of the very great examples of a trend that overpasses the understanding of it. So exactly what you were just explaining of, decentralized, self-managed, autonomous ownership. And I think if you say that to any group of people, 90% of them will say this is fantastic. This is just utopia. I want to do that. I want to be my own boss. But then, at least in my experience, in reality, people struggle quite a lot with that. There's always this longing for, can someone please tell me what to do? How is that how is that your experience within these projects that you're working on? How do people cope with that?
Yeah, very interesting. So I think I'm not going to pretend like we haven't had some examples of that. We definitely had. And again, actually, maybe perhaps some of the more senior people, it can be a very different way of operating in the Web3 space. And sometimes you just I want to be able to go to one person for a decision that I can just then run off. And that's just not the way it works. You know, you're having to sort of interact with many different stakeholders and sort of figure things out. However, that's definitely in the minority right now because I think it's self-selecting, which is, you know, we're still at the very early days. And people who are already interested in the Web3 space are interested in it because these principles apply to the products, the blockchain, as much as it does the employee experience. So I think why we've not seen more of that right now is because the people who are joining, first of all, it's a responsibility for people in the space to educate. So if I'm speaking to someone who's not worked in this space, you know, we're very clear about what to expect, the pros, the cons. And so I think, you know, it's definitely on us as a sort of people and talent professionals to make sure we educate and are clear in our branding, etc. But I think right now, because we're still early, that most people coming into the space kind of know what it's about and are excited because of that. They're coming in it because of these things. Now, that will be, you know, that's, I guess, a question that we'll see in terms of, do some of these practices actually, will they become more mainstream? Or as you say, is there just like differences there? That's TBC for sure.
It's a tiny hint towards why there's a different salary market for blockchain, because it's very, very self-selective. You can't really educate people on it because the hurdle is so big.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And you know, the employment practices aside, as when it comes to Web3, you can't really expect anybody to understand the space until you're using, you know, if you try and explain what the internet is, like, that's a very hard concept to explain. And Web3 is just exactly the same. It's like hard to try and talk about it. It's only when we're all every day interacting with different platforms or dApps, or whether that's I'm gaming and I take my something from Sword from one game and take it to another and then could sell it on the marketplace, or I can send you money quickly, easily, no matter where you are. I think it's when we are all using the products that people will understand it and they'll get the benefit. But it's very hard right now. It's like, it obviously has a pretty bad reputation in many areas. And so I think it's just about, it's on us working in the industry to get products into the hands of people. And then I think the benefits will be a lot clearer.
I couldn't agree more. Definitely. I'm a big believer in the space as well. I wanted to ask you before we wrap up. You walked us through like the people practices in a Web3 business or company or project. What do you think Web2 businesses can learn from this space?
I think what Web3's done well is we all have different ways of working. You know, us three are completely different in how we like to operate, and trying to have a one size fits all is very difficult to keep people happy and motivated and recruit people who like working in that one way. So for me, it's about the flexibility is key here, which is allow me to set up how I work best. You know, give me, now, of course, that needs to work for the company as well. And we have to meet in the middle. But I think the more that we can give people the ability to fix the way they like to work. So don't force me to come into an office for 5 days a week if like I'm much better heads down, you know, for 2 days of those weeks. I want to be at home and actually get my deep thinking done. You know, I think Web3 is very good at, in general, letting people figure out what works for them and set up their own sort of working environment. And I think that's the elements that Web2 can learn from in Web3. And I'm sure already we see so many companies doing this very well, but I think that's some of the threads that we'll see more and more as we kind of move forward.
Ian, fantastic. That's a beautiful point to end. Thank you so much for your time today.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me.